I was one step away from hearing my grandson's first cry when the security guard stopped me and said I was not on the authorized list. The words didn't make sense at first, not in a place like St. Mary Medical Center, where I had just rushed in with my purse still hanging open and my hands shaking from excitement. I remember thinking that there had to be some mistake, that surely someone had confused my name with another visitor, because I was Evelyn Carter, I was the grandmother, and my son Daniel had called me himself earlier that morning to tell me the baby had finally been born. But the security guard, a tall man named David Harris with a calm, professional voice, didn't move aside. He looked down at his tablet again and repeated that access was restricted to approved visitors only, as listed by the mother and hospital authorization contact. My heart dropped slightly at the mention of the mother, because I already knew without being told that meant Jessica Miller, my daughter-in-law. I tried to smile, tried to keep my voice steady as I explained that I had driven nearly 40 miles from my home in Oak Ridge just to be here, that I had blankets in my car for the baby, that my son was expecting me. But David only nodded politely and said my name wasn't on the list. Behind him, through the glass doors, I could see the soft movement of nurses walking down the hallway, the quiet rhythm of a place where life had just begun, and yet I was standing still, frozen outside of it. I reached for my phone immediately and called Daniel. It rang once, twice, then went to voicemail. I tried again. No answer. I texted him, telling him I was downstairs and asking where they were. Minutes passed, but the only response I received was not from him, but from Jessica. The message was short, almost too calm. We've decided to limit visitors for now. Please respect our space. I stared at the screen, reading it again and again, feeling something unfamiliar settle in my chest. Not anger yet, but confusion sharpening into something heavier. I looked back at the security guard, hoping he might soften, but he only stepped slightly aside to let another family pass through, as if I had already been quietly placed outside of something I was still part of in name only. Somewhere beyond the doors, I could hear faint sounds of celebration, soft laughter, the kind of joy that should have included me. Instead, I stood there in the hospital lobby under the white fluorescent lights, realizing I had been physically stopped from reaching my own grandson, and for reasons no one had bothered to explain. I remained standing in the hospital lobby long after the message faded from my phone screen, feeling as if the world around me continued moving while I had been quietly removed from it. People passed by me carrying flowers, small blankets, and paper cups of coffee, all of them moving with purpose toward rooms I was no longer allowed to enter. I tried to steady my breathing, telling myself there had to be a simple explanation, a misunderstanding, or a temporary restriction made in the rush of delivery. I looked again at the security desk, where David Harris was now speaking softly into his radio, occasionally glancing in my direction as if confirming I was still there, but not meant to be moved forward. I asked myself when things had shifted like this, when I had gone from being someone expected at every family milestone to someone requiring approval just to stand near my own grandchild. My phone remained in my hand, warm from repeated attempts to reach Daniel Carter, but each unanswered call only deepened the silence between us. I sent another message, this time slower, more deliberate, asking him simply to come to the lobby so I could understand what was happening. No response came. Instead, I found myself staring at the reflection in the glass doors, noticing how tired I looked despite the excitement I had carried only an hour earlier when I left my home. I thought back to the months leading up to this moment, small changes I had once dismissed as stress or coincidence. Jessica Miller had always been polite, always careful with her words, but there had been an increasing sense of distance in her tone whenever I was mentioned in conversation. Family dinners had become shorter, invitations less frequent, and decisions about holidays had often been made without me being asked. Daniel had explained it each time as her being overwhelmed, adjusting to pregnancy, needing space, and I had accepted those explanations because I wanted peace more than I wanted to question my place in their lives. But standing here now, outside a door I could not pass through, those memories felt different, as if they had been quietly building toward this moment without my awareness. A nurse walked past me carrying a chart and paused briefly, offering a polite smile before continuing on, and I wondered if she knew I was not allowed beyond the entrance I was standing beside. I considered calling Daniel again, but something in me hesitated, a growing uncertainty about whether he would answer differently if he chose to answer at all. The lobby felt colder now, though I could not tell if it was the air conditioning or something inside me settling into acceptance. I sat down in one of the plastic chairs near the wall, still facing the hallway doors, and told myself I would wait a little longer, because surely no family could begin something as important as this without eventually realizing who was missing. I stayed seated in the hospital lobby, watching every movement near the glass doors as if they might suddenly open and change everything. Time felt uneven, stretching longer than it should, broken only by the steady footsteps of people passing in and out of St. Mary Medical Center. I kept my hands folded tightly in my lap, trying to calm the tension building inside me, repeating to myself that Daniel Carter would eventually appear and explain what was going on. But as minutes passed, the silence from him felt less like an oversight and more like a decision I was not included in. I finally stood up and approached the security desk again, where David Harris was now reviewing something on his tablet with quiet concentration. I asked him if he could check again, just to confirm there had not been a mistake in the visitor list, and he hesitated before turning the screen slightly toward me. On it, I saw categories of approved visitors for maternity floor access, carefully organized and marked with specific names. My eyes moved quickly across the list, searching for Daniel Carter, for my own name, for anything that made sense, but what I saw instead made my chest tighten in a slow, controlled way. Under a section labeled Immediate Family Access, there were only 3 entries: Jessica Miller, Dr. Amanda Reynolds, and attorney Michael Grant. No mention of grandparents. No mention of extended family. I asked David quietly what that meant, and he responded with professional detachment, explaining that access restrictions had been submitted by the designated family coordinator earlier that morning. The term family coordinator echoed in my mind because it was not a medical term, it was a decision-making role, and I already knew who had chosen it. I stepped back slightly, feeling the weight of understanding begin to settle in, not as shock, but as recognition that something deliberate had been put in place before I even arrived. I tried calling Daniel again, but this time I left a voicemail, keeping my voice calm and measured, telling him I was downstairs and simply needed him to come speak with me. When I ended the call, I noticed a nurse at the front desk glance briefly in my direction before lowering her eyes, as if she already understood the situation without needing to be involved. I returned to my chair near the wall, but I could no longer sit still, so I began walking slowly along the lobby, passing rows of waiting families who were receiving updates, laughter, or tears, all forms of connection I was no longer part of. At one point, I stopped near a window and saw my reflection again, noticing how my expression had changed without me realizing it, from expectation to quiet uncertainty. I thought about Jessica Miller and how carefully she had always controlled conversations about family plans, how every change had seemed reasonable on its own, but now formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. A notification finally appeared on my phone, not from Daniel, but from Jessica again, stating simply that things were complicated and that I should wait to be contacted when appropriate. The word appropriate lingered in my mind longer than I expected because it implied someone had already decided what my role in this moment was allowed to be, and it was not the one I had imagined when I left home that morning. I found myself standing in the same hospital lobby, but something inside me had shifted in a way I could not yet name. It was not anger, not yet, but a quiet recognition that I had stepped into a situation where decisions had already been made long before I arrived. I walked slowly back toward the seating area, but instead of sitting, I remained standing near the wall, watching the glass doors as if Daniel Carter might suddenly appear and restore the order I believed still existed between us. My phone felt heavier in my hand now, not because of its weight, but because of what it represented. Every unanswered call, every message that returned nothing but silence or carefully chosen words from Jessica Miller. I replayed the earlier conversation in my mind, the security guard's calm explanation, the list of approved visitors, the absence of my name as if it had never belonged there in the first place. That thought lingered longer than I expected, and as it did, something else began to surface beneath it, memories I had not considered important until this moment. I thought about the last few months of Daniel's life, how conversations had slowly become shorter, how visits had turned into scheduling discussions instead of spontaneous family moments. Jessica had always framed it as organization, as efficiency, as the need to reduce stress during pregnancy, and I had accepted those explanations because they sounded reasonable when spoken with confidence. I remembered one dinner in particular, about 3 months earlier, when I had brought over a small blanket I had knitted for the baby. Jessica had smiled politely, but suggested we keep gifts stored at my home until after delivery due to space management. At the time, I had nodded without question, telling myself that young parents needed structure, not interference. Now, standing in this hospital lobby, that memory felt different, like a single piece of a pattern I had not yet been willing to see. I noticed a couple nearby being guided toward the maternity wing by a nurse, their excitement filling the space around them with something warm and immediate, and I felt a quiet distance between their experience and my own. I sat down again, this time not because I was waiting for something specific, but because I felt the weight of uncertainty settling into my legs. I tried Daniel's number once more, listening carefully as it rang, hoping that this time would be different, but again it ended without him answering. I left another message, slower this time, asking not for explanation, but simply for presence, telling him I was still downstairs and I needed to understand what had been decided about me. When I ended the call, I looked up and saw David Harris watching me again, not unkindly, but with the distant professionalism of someone who had already fulfilled his role in the situation. It occurred to me then that I was not waiting for permission to enter a room anymore. I was waiting for permission to remain part of something I had believed was already mine by default, and that realization settled over me with a stillness that made everything around me feel slightly further away than before. I remained seated near the hospital wall, but the idea of waiting no longer felt passive. It felt like something was being decided in real time without my presence, as if my place in this moment depended on approvals I had never been informed about. The lobby around me continued its steady rhythm of arrivals and departures, families moving toward the maternity floor with quiet anticipation, while I stayed anchored in a space that felt increasingly separate from them. I checked my phone again, not expecting a different result, and as I predicted, there was still no response from Daniel Carter. Instead, a new message appeared from Jessica Miller, this time more detailed than before, explaining that all communication regarding visitors was being handled through hospital administration to avoid confusion during recovery. The wording was calm, almost procedural, but it carried a finality that made my grip on the phone tighten slightly. I stood up and approached the reception desk, asking politely if I could speak with someone from maternity coordination, and after a brief pause, the receptionist directed me to a side office near the main corridor. Inside, a hospital coordinator reviewed my information with quiet efficiency, occasionally glancing at a computer screen before speaking in a measured tone. She explained that visitor authorization had been submitted electronically earlier that morning and that the request had been processed under a restricted access protocol initiated by the designated primary family contact. When I asked who that contact was, she hesitated only briefly before confirming it was Jessica Miller, listed as the approved decision authority for postpartum visitor management. Hearing it stated so plainly made something inside me shift, because it was no longer speculation or interpretation, it was administrative fact embedded into the system of the hospital itself. I asked if Daniel Carter had also been involved in the decision, and she replied that his name appeared only as patient support, without listed authority over visitor permissions. The distinction between those roles felt small on paper but enormous in meaning, and I found myself struggling to understand when my own relationship to my grandson had been reduced to something requiring permission rather than assumption. I left the office and returned to the lobby, but I did not sit this time. Instead, I walked slowly along the glass windows overlooking the parking lot, trying to steady my thoughts. I remembered the years I had spent helping Daniel through school, through his first job, through moments when he had called me before making decisions that now felt distant from the man I was waiting for inside this hospital. I had always believed those years meant something permanent, something that could not be quietly reassigned or redefined. Yet everything unfolding now suggested otherwise, not through confrontation, but through structure, documentation, and silence. My phone buzzed again, and for a brief moment I thought it might finally be Daniel, but it was instead a notification from the hospital system confirming visitor status updates. My name was not included in any category of access. I stood still for a long moment, reading the message repeatedly, each line confirming what I was beginning to understand without wanting to fully accept. And in that quiet realization, I understood that what was happening was not a misunderstanding waiting to be corrected, but a boundary already drawn long before I ever arrived at these doors. I was still standing near the hospital windows when the weight of everything began to feel less like confusion and more like confirmation of something I had not wanted to see. The messages on my phone had stopped bringing explanations and instead only reinforced the same quiet message that decisions about access, presence, and even acknowledgement had already been finalized without my input. I walked slowly back toward the seating area, but I did not sit immediately, instead watching the movement of hospital staff and visitors as they passed through the secured doors leading to the maternity floor. Each person who entered seemed to carry a clear purpose, a defined place, and an accepted role within what was happening behind those doors, while I remained in a space that felt increasingly undefined. I thought again about Daniel Carter, about how many times I had been the person he called first in moments of uncertainty, and how easily that pattern now seemed to have dissolved into silence. When I finally did sit down, it was not from exhaustion, but from the realization that standing did not change anything about my position in this situation. My phone vibrated again, and this time the message came from a hospital administrative contact, confirming that visitor restrictions were active and that all exceptions required approval from the designated family coordinator. There was no emotional language in the message, only structure, policy, and closure. I read it more than once, each repetition making the separation between what I believed and what was now official feel more absolute. I looked up and noticed David Harris watching the entrance again, his posture unchanged, as if nothing about the last hour had altered the normal flow of his responsibilities. I considered asking him another question, but I already knew the answer would not change the situation, only define it more clearly. Instead, I began thinking about Jessica Miller, not with anger, but with a growing awareness of how thoroughly she had organized the environment surrounding this moment. It was not a single action that created the distance I was experiencing, but a series of quiet decisions that now formed a complete system around access and exclusion. I remembered how she had always spoken calmly during family discussions, how her words had often carried an air of practicality that made it difficult to challenge without sounding unreasonable. At the time, I had interpreted that as confidence, perhaps even care, but now I was beginning to recognize how easily structure could replace openness when no one questioned it early enough. A nurse passed by and briefly checked the reception desk before continuing down the hallway, and I noticed how even small movements in this space followed rules I was not part of. I checked my phone again, this time not expecting a response, and found none. The absence of communication had become its own form of message, more consistent than anything that had been said. I leaned back slightly in the chair and closed my eyes for a moment, not in defeat, but in an attempt to organize my thoughts into something stable. What I realized, sitting there in the quiet of the lobby, was that I was no longer waiting to be invited into a moment that was happening upstairs. I was waiting to understand how I had already been removed from it long before I ever arrived. I sat in silence longer than I intended, not because I was waiting for something new to happen, but because I was trying to understand how everything had shifted without a single moment of direct confrontation. The hospital lobby around me continued its steady rhythm, but I no longer felt part of it in the same way. Every notification, every unanswered call, every carefully worded message had created a pattern that now felt undeniable. I looked down at my phone again, and for the first time I did not immediately try to call Daniel Carter. Instead, I simply held the device in my hand and observed the absence of his response as if it were its own kind of answer. My thoughts kept returning to Jessica Miller, not as an emotional reaction, but as a presence that had gradually expanded its influence over every point of contact between me and my son. I began to see how each decision I had once accepted as reasonable, each explanation about organization or timing or stress, had slowly built toward this exact separation. A hospital staff member walked past and paused briefly near the entrance, scanning a list on a clipboard before continuing down the corridor, and I noticed how even the smallest actions in this environment were governed by systems I had no access to. I stood up again and walked toward the glass doors, stopping just short of them, watching the faint movement beyond as if distance alone could still be measured and crossed if I understood it properly. I thought about the years I had been present in Daniel's life without question, the countless times I had been called in moments of uncertainty, the assumption that family presence was not something that needed approval. That assumption no longer existed in this space. I turned slightly and saw David Harris still at his post, his expression unchanged, and I realized that from his perspective nothing unusual was happening at all. That realization unsettled me more than anything else, because it suggested that what felt like exclusion to me had already been normalized elsewhere. I returned to my seat, but I no longer checked my phone repeatedly. Instead, I began observing the flow of people entering and leaving with a different kind of attention, noticing who was guided forward without hesitation and who required verification at every step. A nurse stopped briefly near the reception desk and mentioned a name I did not recognize, followed by immediate clearance through the secured door, and I felt the contrast between inclusion and restriction more sharply than before. My thoughts drifted again to Jessica Miller, not in anger, but in analysis, as I tried to understand how her influence had extended beyond personal interaction into procedural structure. It was no longer just about what she said or did, but about what had been formally established in her presence. I opened my phone one more time and scrolled through the messages again, noticing how each one had progressively reduced my role from participant to observer. The language had shifted from family references to administrative terms, from emotional connection to controlled access. I placed the phone back into my bag slowly, as if acknowledging that continuing to seek immediate answers would not change what had already been put in place. Sitting there under the hospital lights, I understood something that settled quietly but firmly in my mind, that the distance between me and what was happening upstairs was not temporary, and it was not accidental. It was structured, maintained, and already accepted by everyone except me. I had been sitting in that chair for what felt like an undefined amount of time when the atmosphere around me subtly changed again, not through sound or movement, but through the arrival of someone I had not seen yet. I noticed it first in the way the hospital staff near the reception desk adjusted their posture slightly, the kind of quiet acknowledgement that happens when a familiar authority enters a space. I looked up and saw Daniel Carter standing near the entrance to the lobby, his face carrying a mixture of hesitation and fatigue that I had never associated with him before. For a moment, I felt an immediate instinct to stand and call his name, but something stopped me, not distance, but the expression on his face as he scanned the room without immediately meeting my eyes. Jessica Miller was beside him, holding a clipboard folder close to her chest, her presence calm and controlled in a way that felt almost incompatible with the tension I had been carrying all morning. Daniel's gaze finally found me, and when it did, there was no surprise, only a heaviness that suggested he already knew this moment would be difficult. I stood slowly, expecting him to walk toward me, but instead Jessica stepped slightly forward, speaking first in a measured tone that immediately shifted the space between us into something formal. She addressed me by name, but not as family, rather as a visitor under restricted status, explaining that hospital guidelines required all communication regarding access to go through designated authorization channels. I remember blinking slowly as I tried to process the fact that my own son stood beside her without interrupting, without correcting, without moving closer. Daniel finally spoke, his voice quiet and restrained, telling me that the situation had been complicated and that it was better for now to follow the hospital process so everything remained calm for the baby and for recovery. The word calm felt misplaced in that moment, because nothing inside me had been calm since I arrived, yet no one seemed to be speaking about that. I asked him directly, keeping my voice steady, whether I was allowed to see my grandson, and there was a pause before Jessica responded instead, saying that visitation would be limited to approved individuals until further notice. I looked at Daniel again, searching for something familiar, something that suggested this was temporary or misunderstood, but his eyes lowered briefly before returning to me with an expression I could not fully read. Around us, the lobby continued its quiet rhythm, people moving past without stopping, as if this exchange existed in a separate layer of reality that only I could feel fully. I noticed how carefully Jessica held the folder, how she referenced it when speaking, as though every answer had already been prepared and documented. When I asked if this decision had been made without my input, Daniel finally exhaled and said that it was not personal, that it was about structure and recovery and avoiding stress during the first days after birth. But even as he said it, I realized that what was being described as structure felt indistinguishable from exclusion. I stepped back slightly, not dramatically, but enough to feel the chair behind me again, grounding me in the physical space while everything else felt increasingly abstract. Jessica concluded by stating that once things stabilized, access could be reassessed, but only through proper channels. I nodded slowly, not because I agreed, but because I understood that disagreement would not change what had already been implemented. Daniel looked at me once more before turning slightly toward Jessica, and in that small movement I recognized something I had not been prepared to see, that the conversation was no longer centered around me, but around a system I had already been placed outside of. I stood still even after Daniel Carter and Jessica Miller finished speaking, because something in me understood that moving immediately would not change the outcome of what had just been established. The hospital lobby felt quieter now, not because the noise had changed, but because my attention had narrowed to a single point of realization that kept repeating itself without needing confirmation. Daniel had been physically present, yet emotionally aligned elsewhere, and that distance created a clarity I could not ignore anymore. I slowly returned to the chair I had been sitting in earlier, but this time I did not look at the entrance expecting him to come back. Instead, I looked at the space around me as if seeing it for the first time, noticing how every interaction I had witnessed today followed a structure I had not been included in. Jessica's words about authorization and access no longer felt like temporary restrictions, but like defined boundaries that had been placed before my arrival and reinforced through each conversation since. I took out my phone again, not to call Daniel, but to scroll through the message history with Jessica, reading the same sentences with a different understanding than before. Each line now felt less like communication and more like documentation of exclusion, carefully phrased to appear neutral while maintaining distance. A nurse passed by and briefly adjusted a chart at the reception desk, and I noticed how even small movements in this environment followed systems I could not influence. Daniel appeared again briefly near the hallway entrance, speaking quietly with Jessica before both of them turned slightly away from the lobby, their attention shifting toward the direction of the maternity wing. He did not approach me this time, and I did not call out, not because I did not want to, but because I realized that calling would not change the position I had already been assigned in this situation. Instead, I observed the space between us, the physical distance that now matched. Something deeper and less visible. I thought about all the years that had led to this moment, not in a nostalgic way, but in an analytical one, as if I was reviewing a sequence of decisions that had gradually redefined my place within my own family. Each explanation I had accepted earlier now aligned into a pattern that no longer felt accidental. The hospital environment continued its steady rhythm, but I felt increasingly separated from it, as if I had been moved to a parallel version of the same event where my role had been reduced without announcement. Jessica returned briefly to the lobby area, exchanging a few words with the coordinator at the front desk, and I noticed how confidently she navigated the process, as if every step had been anticipated and approved long before today. Daniel remained near the hallway entrance, occasionally glancing in my direction, but never closing the distance between us. I remained seated, not because I was waiting anymore, but because I was trying to understand the full shape of what had been decided without me. When I finally looked down at my phone again, I did not feel the need to search for new answers. The silence from Daniel, the structured responses from Jessica, and the formal tone of the hospital system all converged into a single conclusion that settled quietly but firmly in my mind. I had not simply been restricted from access to a room. I had been reassigned within a system that no longer recognized my presence as necessary, and that realization stayed with me longer than any message or conversation from that morning.